All right, I'm just going to give it a moment for students to populate in. Welcome, everybody. This is the Computer Studies Networking panel. I see everybody popping in now. Welcome. We'll begin in just a moment. Once the number kind of slows down a little bit. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending today. Okay, so we're going to start off. My name is Erin Chafe. I'm with the Georgian College Alumni Association. Just watching for the numbers so that they make sure that everybody's in before we begin. So today's session is going to be recorded. Since you're attending today's session, you'll receive an email within the next 24 hours with a link to the recording. So feel free to fully engage in this session today. Our panelists are absolutely amazing and here to answer all of your questions. And we do have questions set up that we'll go through. So I'm going to get started. Again, my name is Erin Chafe. I'm from the Georgian College Alumni Association. And with the Alumni Association, we'll begin today's session as we begin all of our events with the Georgian College Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. So Georgian College acknowledges that all campuses are situated on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people. The Anishinaabe include the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. Georgian College is dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to pass the session today now over to Olena to introduce our panelists.
Hello, everybody. My name is Olena Konstantinovska. I'm the Employer Engagement Consultant with the COPA and Career Success Department, and I'm just helping out with these sessions. I would like to welcome now Justin, Virginia, Michael, and Chris, four of our amazing panelists. And we will start with Justin, who is going to introduce himself.
Hello there. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. My name is Justin Sheik. I graduated from Georgian, I believe it was 2018, with both Michael and Chris. I think they may have been a little later than me, but I'm not sure. Did 2-year programmer course, and now I'm working for Myovision in Kitchener. Originally started with Manulife and moved there recently.
Thank you. Chris?
Hi, everyone. My name's Chris. I graduated from the 3-year COPA program in 2017. Currently, I am an engineering team lead and engineering tech lead at a company called Deluxe. Michael?
Hi, everyone. My name's Michael Joyce. Like Chris, I graduated from the COPA program in 2017. I then transferred to the University of Guelph to complete my Bachelor of Computing. And since May of last year, I've been working as a business solutions consultant for an organization called Traction on Demand. They are based in Burnaby, British Columbia, but I am based in Kitchener, Ontario.
Thank you. Virginia?
Hi there, I am Virginia Barlow. I am the Digital Transformation Specialist and Makerspace Coordinator at Georgian College. I went through the COPA program, the 2-year program, and enjoyed it a lot. I graduated in, I believe 2019, maybe 2018. That's a little sketchy for me, but I work at the Makerspace at the college, and I'm also faculty for the Entrepreneurship Department.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, everybody. So we are going to move with our questions. I will be asking questions, and our awesome panelists are going to answer those. So the first question is for the computer programmer and computer analyst program. So the question is, identify and describe some tools that enable you to work collaboratively remotely on the program code. Any takers?
all you, Chris.
Cool. Yeah, so actually, since the last time that I did this, I transitioned jobs, and with that, I've started using some new tools. So at my current place, we use Office 365 for pretty much everything. So we have like a slew of different things, Microsoft Teams for communication for meetings, as well as using, when it comes to actually like code, we use Visual Studio Code, Live Share for like pair programming, and then also using GitHub Enterprise for any of our PRs and commenting on other people's work. So that in a short, there's a bunch of other stuff, but maybe not as relevant. Anyone else?
Yeah, I find it kind of funny because I transitioned as well in August, and we were actually moving away from those items. Originally, we were using Teams and Office 365, but now I'm at a company that uses Slack primarily for contact. It also allows sharing of code snippets a little easier and a little cleaner. Integration with your pipelines and stuff like that as well. We also use Visual Studio Code Share, as well as we do have some .NET developers that use Rider, which I think they just do calls for that one. And then, yeah, we use GitHub as well. We're moving into GitLab probably the end of the year.
For myself, we use Zoom quite often when we're doing makerspace activities. We'll use Zoom and then a lot of shared screen activity so that other people can take over control of other people's screens. So that tends to help quite often. And then, of course, the Visual Studio Code Live Share also is an excellent tool.
And then I work in consulting. And I also work in the Salesforce space. So my answer might be a little different, or a combination of the three before me. It's really dependent on the tools that the client that we're working with is comfortable with. And it's about really adapting quickly to those tools. But broadly speaking, we use Git either through Bitbucket or Azure DevOps, which is Azure DevOps is a really nice one for collaborating on code and working through like an agile sprint framework. We use Slack as our primary internal communication tool. Slack, you may know, it was recently purchased by Salesforce. And there are a lot of integrations that we have with Slack and our organization's internal Salesforce org, which lets us keep track of projects, identify pieces of code or functionality that we could reuse from one client and put into another client's project to kind of speed up that development time. And we use a tool called GearSet to do a lot of that movement, which is a Salesforce specific tool that lets us move code from Salesforce environments to other Salesforce environments, or from Salesforce environments to source control and vice versa.
Thank you. So we're going to go to the question from Interactive Media Design and Web Design program, and we're going to continue talking about tools. So the next question is, which tools are currently the industry standard for web design and development?
So I don't know how many of us here actually work in the interactive media design area. Chris has stepped out by the looks of it. I did web design for 4 years. I did not take the web design course, but the tools that we did use on top of the ones that we had mentioned for the computer programmer side of things, because I did work from that side, we also did design. Right, excuse me. Currently, right now, for stuff like wireframing, we use Figma, is a popular one these days. It makes it easy for developers to like zoom in really close on the one item they need to code and stuff like that, as well as share that information at a large scale. We use Confluence for documentation. For UX UI, on top of Figma, we'll also use the built-in Chrome connections with Lighthouse, as well as other SAO, or SE, is it SAO or SEO? I think it's SEO technology that is out there to give our platforms easier searchability and better accessibility. That's actually a main thing as of the last few years is accessibility has become a mainstay and should be taught everywhere, in my opinion. But that's all built into Chrome, luckily. So anybody else?
Something that I've noticed a lot of is the rise of the no-code websites. So things like using Figma, things like using Webflow, they have their whole online courses and everything like that. I've seen the rise of the no-code. I work a lot with entrepreneurs, so it's really easy for them to find someone who is working with a no-code website design and have it done a little bit faster or cheaper than it is to have like a nice proper website. And then I see them investing shortly after that period, after they have like their basic website up, they'll invest in an actual well-done website after that to have proper APIs and like proper web development built into it. But for like a lot of the entrepreneurs that I'm seeing in the beginning stages, they're definitely being driven towards those no-code sessions.
When you say no code sessions, you mean stuff like Wix, like the stuff you see on YouTube.
Yeah, it's all of that really easy drag and drop, build a website out. They're never going to be perfect websites. That's why we have a lot of our entrepreneurs starting with that and then going to a proper web developer after once they've gained some money, they've gained some traction, and then they get a proper web developer to actually build it out with better APIs and better like workability.
True. Yeah, one of the comments on that is I actually started in web design by using WordPress and tools like that with ICANN Interactive, which was a company through the Entrepreneurship Center there. And it was a good learning experience, but I highly recommend that, like you said, moving away from that if you end up starting a business because you'll learn the code a lot easier. I was kind of thrown into the deep end when it came to PHP and custom applications, so I don't really advertise for those drag and drop systems much, but it's all up to what you guys feel is your route after school.
Yeah, it's the same. So specifically within this kind of Salesforce ecosystem, if you're making a user-facing website, which isn't super frequent, but is a tool that we do use sometimes, it is a similar sort of drag and drop framework. And there's a lot that you can do out of the box with that drag and drop kind of component architecture. But at a certain point, if you want things exactly a specific way, and you really want to drive a specific experience for the people who are going to be using your website, it does come down to a lot of custom development. Like whether that's using something like a proprietary framework. There's one within Salesforce called Lightning Web Components, but it's built on the same standards as any other web component architecture system. So you can use things like Angular or React or even Vue.js if you prefer as an alternative. But definitely those drag and drop tools have come a long way. I think across the industry, they've gotten to a much better spot than they would have even like 5 or 10 years ago. But there's still that gap that you can really only bridge if you're going to do something actually custom.
I also find, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I say that's the same when I teach for makerspace activities. I teach Bootstrap, and I just show you how to use like the basics of Bootstrap, but even going between like Bootstrap 4.5 and Bootstrap 5.1, which they just moved to, like there's no Jumbotron anymore. So they're taking aspects out of it. So if your website was built on one form, it's starting to like, it'll break. It'll hit those points where it's going to be breaking.
Yeah, I find it funny as well when it comes to these drag and drop programs. They're very dynamic, and coming from somewhere where we wanted to make everything dynamic from a coding perspective, that idea is in both cases, which is why I think they've come a long way. So always think dynamically with your code, especially when working on web design.
Thank you, everybody. We have a follow-up question on that note. What tool is your company using for tracking bugs, assigning it to resources, reporting, and resolving and closing it?
So normally with this, we use, at least my team, both Manulife and MyoVision, have used Jira, which is a Confluence, or I can never say the real name, but the company that owns Confluence, it's their product. And what it does is it tracks tickets similar to, in a card form. So if the QAs find a bug, they mark it as a ticket. The ticket is marked as a bug and means you need to fix it as soon as you have time. When you pick it up, it goes in progress, then fixed, and however your team sets it up. In my case, it goes to the QAs test that it's gone, and then they mark it as done. So that manages a whole board of them. Like we have 100 or 150 tickets on the go right now. So it's definitely monitored fairly frequently.
Yeah, similar to the other technology questions, for myself, it depends on the client. Jira is one that we've used in the past. Atlassian, yeah, it's a difficult word. So we use Jira and Azure DevOps. And then there's another in-house tool that's been built by developers at my organization that we use for some projects. But again, we kind of have to adjust what tools we're using based on what the client expectations are.
If you want to get a free version of something similar to what I've seen, look up Trello. It's very similar to a Jira board. You can play around with it, use it to manage your group projects or even just personal projects. It really does keep your time organized, and you'll get a feel on how these things work in the industry for paid products.
Mm-hmm. There's another one I've used that I think is a free trial, and you're able to use it with like a small team for free, called ClickUp, which is, I guess, a little more complex than Trello, but still fairly intuitive.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move on to the next question. Describe 3 real-world problems that you might solve with code during your career. Using different methodologies, explain how you would approach solving those problems through code.
I guess one, yeah, these are kind of tough to think of off the top of the head. But one thing that we deal a lot with is integration. Integrating Salesforce or a different product with, again, an external product. It could even be like linking one Salesforce org, which is just a fancy word for environment, to another environment. So a lot of times that'll rely on something like SOAP APIs, or it could be an XML feed. There's different approaches. The first thing we need to take into account is like, what is the data that we can get out of the system and what format does it come out of the system? And then for the receiving system, like what is the data that we can intake, and what sort of response is the external system expecting in terms of, like, you know, how do we register any sort of errors to the external system? Do we just say like, yes, this has been sent? Do we give some sort of like percentage of what records were able to be updated correctly or updated successfully? So the first step in like any of those integration projects is, what does the source system look like and what does the destination system look like, and how does the data differ between those? You also want to keep in mind like things like locale or character sets, different languages, things like that can trip you up when you're doing any sort of integration work from one system to another.
Yeah, for sure. To add on that, one of the interesting problems I've had recently, a lot of people don't use Angular that much anymore when it comes to front end, but my team does. And the thing that I'm doing right now is bringing a module in that's a lower Angular version. And that's an interesting problem you see quite a bit, is that you're integrating something, especially with NPM and Node, where it's so easy to install them so simply, but the versioning is off. The only thing you can really do at that point with issues like that is start with the error log, start at the top. One little tip when it comes to these things is start at the top, but your problem is more than likely not going to be the first error on the list. A lot of the time it's the third, fourth, fifth error down, and you're trying to fix the first one, but you're just hitting a wall. Read through the entire thing and take it step by step. You will get through it. You'll be confused for a while, but you will get through it.
When it comes to debugging things, I did some a little bit of teaching as well. So I went through a lot of student assignments, and that was really exciting for me. So I got to debug a lot. And something that I did notice is there's sort of like 3 things to start with. The first thing is, did you miss a semicolon? And where did you miss it? So I like to, the second thing I will do is I will read backwards through my code. Instead of reading it the same way that I've read it before, I'll read backwards through it. And that generally helps me pick out funny things like spelling errors, places where I've missed, brackets or semicolons. Or if I'm using Visual Studio Code, if I'm looking at my code with that, they have a great option where it actually lets you know if you hover over some of your, what do we call them? Your classes or your things like that. And you hover over it, it'll let you know whether or not that's been used. So if you're trying to figure out, hey, why isn't this class working? You can hover over it and it'll let you know if you've actually used it anywhere. So perhaps you just forgot to call the function, is a lot of the times. So those are my 3 things that I'll do. So read backwards, check for spelling errors, and look for your semicolons.
Little tip on the hovering thing you mentioned. If you control click on it, it will actually open up a box that gives you exactly where that class / variable was used and what line on which in any file. One of the things that I do as well, and this may sound a little nuts, but I got a little 3D printed Totodile Pokemon, if you don't know what that is, from our makerspace way back in school. Still have it somewhere, but something Ross Bigelow, the coordinator when I was there, would always tell me is, if you get stuck, take a break, take 5 minutes, come back, and if that doesn't work, talk to an inanimate object. Get the talk out the process, and you will more than, he's got a little cactus there, it will help you get through your problem. I know he's here somewhere, but yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. We're going to move on to the question from media design. In which ways will you need to show creative and critical thinking techniques in a web design or development position?
Virginia, you're muted.
I was just saying, when you need to show those skills directly in your wireframing stage, like right at the beginning, at the planning stages, that's where you want to know where things are going, how you think things are going to work, why they're going there. Because sometimes after you place something somewhere, that doesn't actually make any sense when you get to the wireframing stage. So it's good to have those moments where you talk, if you're in a group, on a team, talk with your team about the building process and actually, pretend to build it out. I use this wonderful whiteboard. It's called Whiteboard. It's fantastic. It's hosted by Miro, and Miro's another amazing, like Trello and ClickUp for work or getting your work sorted. But it's fantastic for doing a quick little mock-up of whatever you want to do. So at the very beginning, those creative and critical thinking techniques in web design, you want to be thinking about those things at the start before you're just getting excited about a project and you start throwing a whole bunch of stuff into the website and you're like, oh my God, this looks great. And then you realize that it's completely unreadable and you have to go back to the drawing board. So I would say right at the beginning of that development process, that's when you want to do it.
You want to go first, Michael?
Sure. I was just going to say a little bit of a different sort of creativity. And if this is something that's, it can vary from organization to organization, whether or not you kind of know this off the start, but consider your budget. Think about, maybe there's 3 different solutions that we have to this specific technical problem. What is the nicest, most scalable one? And how expensive is it compared to something that will get the job done? Sometimes it's about like taking a step back and thinking, why does this job need to be done in the first place? But other times it's really a creativity of resources and sort of like, what is a way that we can begin kind of solving this problem without spiraling into like some sort of scope creep situation? Because as you get into the world of work, budget is going to be an important factor in a lot of IT endeavors. Because the truth is that like IT can be very expensive. It can be considered a cost center. So you kind of funnel money into IT and you're not 100% sure what you're actually getting out of it as an organization. So it's important that you bear that budget in mind when you're coming up with your solutions and making sure that if you're going to go with like the highest budget option, you've got a good reason. And that could be something like scalability, where you can say, yes, this is going to be a more expensive option for us right now. And this is going to be a more expensive solution to implement, but we're going to implement it once and we're not going to change it for 5 years.
Yeah, so where I was going to go was more of the downstream creative side of the planning. When it comes to, and you're going to hear me say this a few times today, the AOTA, or the accessibility behind things. And this is mainly because I'm an accessibility professional. I have certification in that field. The ability to think of somebody with disabilities when you're coding your or writing out your design can sometimes be ignored or just forgotten. For example, the product that I'm working on now, no one who is blind can use it, but that's because my job strictly relies on vision. When it comes to other websites, if you zoom in too far and a button's unusable, say the submit button on a form at a bank is unusable, well, then that person can't use your banking software. So what's the point of them being with you? So there's a lot of things in that aspect, and there's rules around that, especially in Ontario, where we have guidelines, but those guidelines are more like, here's the problem and here's how you fix it. So you're not left in the dark. So those are some of the things you want to think of earlier on, especially in your design. Is this color gonna, like for example, the URL links in this chat, if they were any brighter of a blue, they would not work out because it's white on a light blue on a white background. That's not compatible. A lot of people can't read that. By the way, Chris, we're on the second question in interactive media design, if you have anything to comment.
Perfect. Okay. I might say some of the same thing that you guys are iterating on. I heard about, accessibility, and yeah, I don't have much to say. I'll chime in on the next question. Sorry, apologies for having to join back. Just some issues.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so let's then talk about
Sorry, Olena, we have a
strategies.
few questions in the Q&A. One is, how do you keep up to fulfill the workplace expectations in the IT environment?
So that really depends. The expectations are normally set by your managers and a little higher up on the flow of command, I guess you could call it. But when it comes to a team environment, there's a couple different things you could do. You have goals as a team, and then you have goals as yourself. And depending on the company, normally it's done quarterly. The tools around that are normally training software like Udemy. Another good one is, I can't remember what it's called. Anyways, a lot of the time they'll say, if you're lacking in a space, you need to work on those areas. You'll get that training and get that done. As a team, if you're lagging behind on code, you'll then create goals in your Jira board or in your Trello board saying, hey, this is what we want to work on next ASAP. So these tools are kind of all over the place. It really depends on how directed that question wants to get.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think like when you join an organization, no matter if it's like a small startup or something that's more corporate, like there's expectations for the role, and sometimes, and I'll be honest, those expectations can be unrealistic. For those of you who are going to be job seeking for the first time, sometimes you'll see entry level positions that require experience, and one of the things that most people will recommend is apply for jobs that you don't qualify for. And when you come into that role, you know, that expectation might be that you have 3 years experience, but working on it and being able to still perform in your role, it might not be at what was expected. But as Justin was saying, I mean, working with your direct manager on trying to figure out areas for improvement, as well as just knowing the area, like your strengths and playing to those strengths, are usually the best way to meet expectations in your workplace. And not all of it is, you know, about writing code. It can be communication, documentation, just being like punctual can, you know, really help when you are lacking in sometimes more like hard skills rather than soft skills.
Yeah, and particularly with larger organizations, those standards in terms of like what you have to do for documentation, what you have to do for code quality, what you have to do for the project management lifecycle, and what your roles are will be well defined. And if they're not well defined, reach out to someone more senior and ask them. Say, hey, I looked around in all of like the company intranet, everything. What is maybe the standard for documentation? How much detail are we supposed to go in? If we're detailing something that's much more specific to maybe one client, how much detail are we supposed to put into that? How do we consider audience? Is this documentation supposed to be for other people in my role? Is this supposed to be for end users? Is this supposed to be for business stakeholders who are a little higher up and want more of a big picture idea? Reach out to a more senior person, and they will either like give you an idea of like, all right, this is what the expectations are. Here's how we follow them. Or they'll say, that's actually a really good point. We should lay out those groundwork rules. Because sometimes it's just either those rules are hard to find, or maybe they haven't been defined yet. And showing that sort of interest in, hey, what is expected at this company, and how do I streamline the onboarding process for new people like me who are a little confused about what the expectations are? It shows really good initiative.
Just to quickly add on to that, Michael, that also affects you in school. That's not just at work. When it comes to, if you get stuck or if you feel like you need feedback, I don't think I would have gotten through my C++ class if it wasn't for the fact that I reached out to the teacher regularly and was like, okay, how can I do better? So that definitely is a thing to keep in mind for both now and when you get in there. Like, don't be afraid to ask. You're there to learn. They know that you're straight out of school. They're not gonna, unless they're really bad employers, and I mean really bad, you'll learn on the job. That's kind of the point of having you there as an entry level position.
Yeah, and to also say to that, like as someone who is not in an entry level position, I'm still learning on the job. There are still things like my company, I'll be honest, is old enough that we have documentation in multiple places, and sometimes you don't know where it is. And so expectations, like, I mean, I'm want to say 6-7 weeks into my new employer, and as a high performer, like the expectation is fairly low right now because I'm still getting the swing of things, trying to understand what the business is trying to solve. And all of this while I'm supposed to be like leading a team. So I'm kind of actually in this position right now where I'm relying on my team to help me succeed by getting me up to speed and stuff like that. And so I would say, yeah, relying on teammates is hugely beneficial for knowledge transfer and everything.
You're a team for a reason.
I think you guys have just sort of went over a couple of questions that are in the chat here. So if you check out the question and answer, you answered a couple of the team building skills. And one of them that I just saw pop up was, as a beginner in my career, how can I learn or experience the decision-making skills and evaluate the outcomes of decision? Basically everything you do. So if you have a job, even if it's just working at Burger King, you are doing decision-making skills and you are working on a team. So you're gathering those skills. Doesn't matter if you're working in code right away, but you're able to use those skills that you're learning on the job to actually gain those things that you'll be using in your teams in the future. So just because it's not necessarily code related doesn't mean that it's not related to the skill set that they're looking for. So remember that point.
Yeah, and to jump in on that, oftentimes as a beginner, unless if you're in sometimes very small organizations, you're probably not going to be forced into a position of having to make decision making, which is, a good like pro and con. But ultimately, like when you're a beginner, a lot of those decisions of where the business is going or the technical solutions that are being done, or even the way of writing code, any sort of like code quality standards are often not up to you, and you're more just maintaining that quality and standard that's been set. But really, I would say if you're wanting to pursue that as an option of being able to make decision making and being able to see the outcomes of those decisions, freelancing is a really great opportunity in order to do that, because oftentimes you end up freelancing for people that don't necessarily know how to make those decisions. And so you get to work with people. And I mean, you're going to make mistakes. I think that goes without saying. And so for better or worse, you're going to see the outcome of your decision, and then that will help drive you for future decisions to not make those same mistakes time and time again.
Yeah, something just to play off that, something my CEO actually said this week in a town hall. He said, you can make decisions, you can sit on a decision and not want to make it because you don't know whether it's going to go good or bad. But until you make that decision, you will not know. It could be good or bad either way. If it's bad, at least you learn from it. So make those decisions, even with your everyday work, like Virginia was saying, like whether you work at Burger King, whether you're at a grocery store, you're still making those decisions. When you get into your position, ask your managers like, hey, can I sit in and listen if this is an open conversation so I can learn what some of the stuff higher up is. I have a co-op I'm working with right now at my company that she's asking about AI growth, and it has nothing to do with what we're doing. She just wants to know how the AI works so she can take that on when she leaves. So they'll be impressed with you just asking like, hey, you want to learn? Okay, let's do this.
And a lot of that kind of evaluating decision making is something that you can put into play right now as a student. Whenever you're done a project, take a look at it and critically think to yourself, you don't have to tell the professor this, but like critically think to yourself, okay, what did I do that went really well? What did I do that didn't go well? And where can I go from here with this project? If I try to add this feature, what sort of hurdles am I going to run into? Or is it going to be clean and simple to do? How would I go about expanding this? How would I go about scaling this up to, instead of being able to be used on like a desktop application, how would I make it into a web application? How would I scale that from like 10 users at a time to 100? Thinking about things like that. No pressure. Like I find it's good to do like after you've already submitted the project and it's already there. And it's going to be graded anyways. You're not thinking about things in terms of like, oh, I could have done this for extra marks. You're thinking in terms of, 10 years down the line, I want this project to still be viable, which may seem a little silly, even if it's because it's just a little school project. But think about those sorts of decisions and how you might tackle them. And I think that gives you a better insight when you're working in terms of, what decisions should I make? What functionality and features should I prioritize if you are in the position to make those decisions, like Chris said?
Yeah. And to also take off of what Michael said, and this is my hopefully last point on this, is like the decisions that you make today, like they impact what you do in the future, but the solution that you choose today doesn't have to be the solution that you use in the future. And this is very common in software projects where you make a business decision today of how to, or a technical solution to a business problem today, but 3-5 years down the road, what you're trying to solve is different. And oftentimes, this can either be building off of what you did before, which maybe isn't ideal, or you could like rewrite it. So it is common where a solution is perfect right now, but as soon as it goes out into the wild, you have a server that can handle 10 people, but all of a sudden you need 100 or 1,000 people, and you need to potentially change the way that you've architected your solution.
So I just wanted to pop in and say we are getting a number of really great questions in the Q&A, and I want to encourage students to populate the Q&A. Our panelists will be going through different questions, so I'm going to leave the Q&A open and then leave all of the questions there because some of them are really great. Panelists will go in also, so keep checking the Q&A because panelists will go in and answer them, like type an answer into them if we have a few moments. But we're going to move on to our listed questions for now, and then we'll pop back into the Q&A and I'll keep an eye on it. So keep populating the Q&A, keep an eye out for written answers from our panelists in there, and hopefully your question will be answered, but we'll review it all before the end of this session just to make sure that we've covered everything. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Erin. So we're going to move on to the next question. What strategies should a web designer or developer use when working collaboratively with other designers, developers, or stakeholders to effectively create web projects?
If I can jump in, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Justin or Michael, but when there was talk about documentation and knowing your audience, I think that's ultimately what is a good way of being able to effectively communicate is, if you're talking to stakeholders who are non-technical, it doesn't make sense to come in with a swagger documentation and end up demoing that to them. And so there's plenty of tools that are out there for, the best tool for the job. In this case, if you're a designer trying to communicate with a developer, it makes much more sense to use prototyping tools like Figma or Sketch and Envision rather than using like a Photoshop file or exporting a PDF and sending it to them, because it does allow for more collaboration. If you're a developer trying to talk with a stakeholder or a designer, you just have to be able to cater and communicate in a way that is mutually understood. So that's what I would say.
I completely agree. When it comes to demoing your work, especially, like this comes for both programmer and media design. The amount of times I've been in a meeting with stakeholders and purely stakeholders, and the developer is showing like code that no one understands, you can just see the stakeholders starting to nod off. So you really have to know your audience. One way I learned how to do that was there was a dynamic presentations course in Georgian you can take as an optional. Highly recommend it. It makes you really good at presentations, able to do demos very easily. It really does help with the talking to people, especially if you're not comfortable with that.
Thank you. Anyone wants to add anything? No, we're good. Moving on to the next question. Describe the key aspects that make a website or mobile optimized web application effective.
I'll hop in on this real quick. The main ones that I know of are performance and usability. Like I've been touting this whole time with accessibility, you want the application to be usable, but you also don't want it stuttering and the person sitting on a loading page for an hour at a time. So having the design when you're designing your databases and your REST connections, or in Michael's example earlier, a SOAP service, you will have to keep that in mind. For example, when I was at Manulife, we had a 30-second load time on the login, and that actually caused timeouts a lot of the time. So you have to keep that in mind when it comes to designing your login page. It was actually due to images trying to be preloaded instead of lazy loaded that caused us to time out. So it's that kind of thing you have to keep in mind when it comes to designing a website, when it comes to web, especially mobile optimized stuff.
Yeah, and to jump in with specifically, mobile optimized, if you're in a situation where something is not optimized, there's plenty of tools out there modern day that can help with it. And that can be anything from examining, the payload that you're sending to the client. So that could be either unused CSS, which is usually pretty minor, JavaScript, and how much you're sending, because essentially the more that you send to the user, the more that client has to parse. And off, like mobile phones, they're using slower processors, usually have less memory. And so you really do have to oftentimes cater to mobile first, rather than trying to cater to desktop first, because if it works on a phone, it's going to work on a desktop. But vice versa is not always true.
And then I guess more from content wise, and this may depend on how much free reign you have in what you're designing or implementing. But you always want to think of like, what are people coming to your website for, and making sure that that's the first thing they see. You could have a nice hero image that's got lots of, cool contrast and inspirational words and stuff like that. But people are coming to your website with a specific goal or purpose or task they're looking to achieve. So make sure that that's the first thing that they see. And that's really more of not even as much as like a computer programming or web design question, as much as it is like an editing question. But it's really just, what is the content that people are looking for, and how do I deliver that content as quick as possible? Otherwise, if it's not immediately apparent, they're just going to go to a different site.
Why do I stick with this business if I can't get my work done at a reasonable speed?
Thank you. So we're gonna ask one more question from the interactive media design program, and then we're gonna move on to the computer programming questions. So the question is, what criteria are used when assessing the requirements of the web project?
So this is just basically a rework of the last question. You basically have to think of all the same things: performance, your design, your accessibility, just to stay at a very, very high level, and cost as well, especially if you're also managing where am I going to host this? Where am I going to put the code, which usually is just Git, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and what I would say is ultimately when you're assessing the requirements of a web project, and this is really common in larger places, is trying to figure out like the why and what, like, what problems are you trying to solve? And sometimes, people will come to you with solutions in mind, and it takes a lot of peeling back at trying to understand, well, what is this solution in their head trying to solve? And sometimes you'll find out that, oh, we need to implement this technology on the home page. And you go, well, why? And they're like, well, it'll help out with marketing, and we'll be able to increase our conversion. And so you start peeling back, and you're like, okay, so they're having conversion issues. And then you find out like, well, why do they need to improve this? And sometimes it's, well, conversion over the last 3 months has dropped. And you go, okay, well, what's happened there? Why has it dropped? And maybe it's not actually this new technology is going to solve that problem. Maybe it's something else has actually caused that issue in the first place. And so you can start evaluating what has happened. If it's like a new project, then you can start asking them about like, well, why do you think that this is going to solve your problem? Is an actual website going to help out? Or, is a really fancy business card actually going to be better at getting you new clients than a portfolio? And so it just kind of depends on what they're trying to solve, and be able to like boil it down from there.
Yeah, there is a different way you could think of this question as well, especially from a freelance perspective, as was mentioned earlier. If you go into freelancing, you're going to want to realize to keep in mind the schedule, the resources, and the scope. And there's a triangle diagram that they show you early on in your course that basically says, hey, you can have it cheap and fast, but it'll be crap. You can basically only have 2 points of the triangle. Cheap and fast will be crap. You can have good quality and high cost, but it'll take a while. Or you can have a quick project with good quality, but it'll cost you a good amount of money. So those are the kinds of things you also want to keep in mind when you're doing stuff like freelancing.
For larger projects too, prioritization of the requirements, and if there's any sort of dependencies. Because if it's a particularly large project and we don't want to sit there doing development for a year before anything gets launched, you want to break things down into where are any sort of bottlenecks or dependencies in the requirements, and what do we consider as different sort of release points? What's the minimum viable product? What's more of a phase 2 kind of idea? What's a phase 3 enhancement, and so on? So that's a good conversation to have if it's a new, larger project, to have with those project stakeholders, in terms of really going back to what Chris was saying of what's the why on this project? How do we begin to solve that or solve that? And then what enhancements do we make beyond that that you're also asking for? And how do we divvy those up between those categories so that we're able to tackle the important must-have things first, and then do the nice-to-haves a little later on down the line.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question. Describe some common database maintenance tasks that should be performed.
All I know is you need to clean it out once in a while. Michael, you know anything?
I don't know how helpful I'm going to be on this one. So a little bit of background: Salesforce is basically a big database, and it's largely managed by Salesforce. Different clients will have different data quality issues that you may have to address. A lot of Salesforce organizations have been around for more than 10 years, so you may have data issues there. We use developer environments, which will have data brought from production. So we'll do things like masking that data so that we're not actually bringing over someone's phone number or SIN number or something like that into some sort of development environment where we're playing around with it as contractors. Backups as well. Like if you are someone who's administering an organization, taking backups at like whatever frequency seems reasonable. And that can depend on your data volume. It can depend on how much data storage space you have available wherever that backup location is. And it can also depend on, I guess, like the resources required to make that backup. If it's something where like you need to shut the system off to do the backup, you have to then take into account like what are people's working hours, how frequently, like does this need to be done every week, every couple of weeks, things like that. There's also additional tools out there, but those tools come with a cost to do some sort of like automated backup within Salesforce. And it's really an evaluation of what are the data needs for the client. You also get into questions of like compliance. So for example, how long do we need to retain this data? A lot of my work is done in financial services. So for example, wealth management in Canada, we need to generally keep any transaction information going back 7 years. So the approach that we take with that may be different than something like maybe a nonprofit that's using this piece of software for like tracking donors or fundraising opportunities, where maybe they have a less stringent data retention policy.
Yeah, and I would also say, some other like maintenance tasks is examining like the queries that are running against your database in order to find any sort of like long running queries, and stuff like, indexing can really optimize queries. I had something that was taking like, I don't know, like 6 minutes to run the query, and I had no optics into it. So I started putting some logging in to catch stuff like that. But then with that, and Justin, you had mentioned this, is exporting of data. Not everything that is in a database is going to be relevant forever. And as Michael says, you have to keep financial records for 7 years, but those 7 years might not actually be relevant in the application the entire time. So exporting it from a primary database into something like a data lake or whatever for processing after the fact is also a way of being able to keep your database small and performant if you're limited on resources or whatever it be.
Yeah, the main stuff I know about databases, the smaller it is, the cheaper it is. So maintenance is usually in that route for my company anyways.
And no one said it, but I'll say patch your database, make sure it's up to date. So that way you don't have any security vulnerabilities.
That's the thing I also know, is that depending how the routes are coded from the front end, you also want to make sure the security is on for that. Because if someone can put in an SQL string into like a first name sign up page, you're getting hit with a DDoS for sure, which will down your server if you're not careful.
Thank you, everybody. So the next question, describe the role that the following network components play with respect to a web application: IP, subnet mask, gateway, DNS server, firewall, port address, and VPC.
Gotta admit, when I heard this first in the one-on-ones, I thought they were trying to get me to do their homework. But it's kind of a long list, but basically it's from front to back, it's the network connections that have to do with your routing, depending on your server. Like for example, the DNS server is a mask over your server, as far as I remember. You put firewalls up to block certain vulnerabilities. It's been a while since I've done networking.
Do you want me to jump in, Justin?
Yes, please.
Cool.
Save me.
You're welcome. So there's a lot here. Like this is essentially understanding the full how an application is able to be accessed. But essentially, like every device has some sort of IP address. It could be a local IP address that says this is your number on this network, or you can have external, and that's how people can access it on the web. And so obviously numbers are not easy to remember. No one wants to remember a series of numbers to go to Google. So a DNS is able to resolve a domain name to an actual IP address. And what happens under the hood is, because there are sometimes multiple servers or multiple web applications that are, say, running on the same server, it's also able to route based off of the application name. So, you could go to google.com and it might, it's Google, so it's probably not running on the same server as, say, like Yahoo, but in theory, it could be able to route to the corresponding application. And then when it comes to port addresses, this is essentially a hole that is in your thing. So you have like port numbers that are able to say, like, this is the port number that I want to communicate on. So in like Node, most applications by default will be on 3000. But when you go to a website and go to google.com, that's on port 80. And when you're on HTTPS, will be port 443. Those are just like kind of standards that people use. And then as for like VPC, which stands for virtual private something, Google will answer me, virtual private cloud, that's the word. So essentially this can be like a, not necessarily like a single firewall, but it's a way of being able to segment your cloud infrastructure. So that way everything that is in that VPC is able to communicate with each other without having to actually reach out externally. And so it's a way of being able to protect your application from outside stuff. And there's like a couple more things, but I'm not going to go too much into it. Anyone else want to jump in? And to be more specific on this, a lot of this you might not necessarily need to do on a day-to-day basis. A lot of this is oftentimes pre-configured for you, and in larger environments is managed by like a DevOps team or a development operations team, or any sort of like cloud infrastructure. A lot of this you don't have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So hopefully this question doesn't concern you too much. Don't be worried.
Thank you, everybody. So now I think we're going to go over our Q&A, the questions that have not been answered. So Arshdeep is asking, how and what technical tools are the most effective tools to be used for documentation analysis to support business?
Justin had put a link into the chat for this, but there's like the Atlassian company has a lot of software that's really effective at helping manage documentation and supporting the business. So Confluence is a product that they have that you can think like a wiki page where you can create, pages and be able to organize it in a tree structure for, whatever it be. And then their side product that goes along with Confluence is Jira, which is more from like a product management side. And then you can actually tie those two together. So you can have the engineering tasks that are in Jira that are oftentimes created by product, but then it will be able to link out to Confluence for kind of more like long lasting documentation, whereas the stuff in Jira is assumed to sort of be shorter lasting.
Yeah, basically everything Chris said. Just iterated what I put in the chat. It's all of the Atlassian products linked together. So you can tag a ticket in a Confluence document, and it's basically a wiki, and it just makes it a lot easier for documentation reasons. But for early game, you could always use your Git. Git does have the wiki feature. So if your group project needs it, then use that. It's easy.
Thank you. We're gonna go to the next question on the Q&A. Samrat is asking, what are the work standards for the developers in your organization? What are the stages or steps that you follow to develop, test, and deploy code?
So it depends on the company for this question. Just so you know, I think the questions are being removed as we answer them. So just there's one at the top there that also we don't want to miss. For work standards, it really depends on the team. A lot of the time, at least from where I've been in, we decide on something called a DOD as a team, which is definition of done. We set rules. So, you have to hit a certain percentage on testing for coverage. You have to alphabetize. This is the one that bugs me the most in my job, but alphabetize your imports. Basically just rules to follow as you're doing your work. And when you merge in your code, it just makes it that much easier when you don't have all these issues to fix later down the line.
Yeah, the other thing that I would say is, and I can't remember if this is done in the 2-year program, but definitely in the 3-year, is the SDLC or software development lifecycle, which is where you'll you end up getting the requirements and then designing and then implementing, then testing, and then usually providing support to that. But how it kind of more works on like a day-to-day basis is oftentimes like we use Jira for everything. So we have, like our predefined tasks that we define every 2 weeks of what we're going to work on. And then what happens is everything goes into a to-do column in like a Scrum board, or if anyone's used Trello. And then you'll be able to grab something from the to-do and it goes into progress and you work on it. Usually you have enough requirements. If not, you can reach out, whether it be designs or technical requirements, anything. And then it will go into a sort of like review phase and a QA phase where either your peers will review your work or you might have a quality assurance team that is making sure that it's working as expected. And then after that, it can go into like a user acceptance testing. So this might be a product owner or someone in the business who actually uses the feature and says, yeah, this is doing what I'm expecting. And then it'll go into like a done status or like ready for release. And then depending on your release cycle, that might be at the end of 2 weeks, it could be right away, or it might be after like 3 to 6 months. You end up releasing that to users and then supporting it after the fact.
Yeah, a lot of the projects that I work on are driven by what's called a statement of work, which is basically a signed contract with between the client and the consulting company, which is this is what we're going to deliver. We've kind of scoped out how long this is going to take. It's a little broad in terms of like the specifics of implementing things. So what we would then do is we would take those feature requirements and we would put those as user stories into whatever software we're using. It could be our internal software that the developers created for project management. It could be something that the client uses if the client prefers a different system and wants us to use that for our user story captures. And then similar to what, well, almost exactly the same as what Chris was saying, where you would go through the process of prioritizing what's going to be done in this specific 2-week sprint, asking any questions if there are still outstanding questions on implementation details to the client, taking one of those stories, building it in a development environment, verifying that it meets the acceptance criteria, pushing it up to a QA environment where you would have someone who didn't build the code tested as well and make sure that they're able to actually get the functionality working as well. Commit it to a Git repository. It's always Git. It's always Git. Yeah. It's one of the things you'll learn is that it's always Git. And then push it up to higher environments as kind of that process goes. And then it can also depend on what the client's commitment is in terms of UAT. So it might be something where they're doing UAT at the end of every 2-week sprint to confirm like that specific functionality is complete. For some clients, it might be something like there's a UAT phase after the build is complete, where it'll be 2 weeks of like involving 10 or 20 people that work day to day in the organization, and only usually 2 or 3 of those in a technical capacity, and the rest of them are actually like business end users. So the people who are going to be using the application to do something not development related. But it can vary from client to client how they approach that UAT testing. And then eventually you have that final deployment, that final go live date. But then that can kind of spawn off into other projects as well, where maybe there's like a phased rollout. So it's all about being flexible with your client's requirements. And that's the same too if you're not consulting. Like it can depend on, like, if you're an internal IT team at a smaller shop, making sure that you agree on like those release phases or what the expectations are for like a deployment or testing to the broader business.
We have a question, Michael. Would you call that agile methodology?
Kind of. It's difficult, right? Because it is consulting, like there is that statement of work. So you do have a good amount of detail in terms of like what you are going to be building and what the goal is after the 6 months. We do still do the idea of sprints and assigning things different effort points and kind of how many points are we committing to this sprint. But generally, I would say it's a little closer to waterfall in that we do have this specific large document that the sales team has developed and outlined. They haven't gone into specifics of how it's going to be implemented. So they also haven't, identified any potential risks that might come with implementation that you might not actually know about unless this is something that you're implementing day to day. But I would say it leans more towards waterfall.
Yeah, and Michael, if say there was a statement of work and something needed to be added, that would be an additional document that would outline the scope of that work, essentially like a mini statement of work for that new feature that would kind of be added on top, versus like Agile, it might just be like, oh, we also need to do this now. And it's not as formal of a process, but more just pivoting for it.
Yeah, correct. One of the things that we always are keeping in mind is the scope, and there's like a little bit of wiggle room in terms of like, does this still fall under the statement of work if it's something that we need to do to achieve something else that's within the statement of work. But you kind of work with your project managers in terms of, is this something that's still covered, or is this where we would initiate what's called a change request? And a change request is that little document that Chris was talking about, which is saying we need X number of hours to give to this developer, this QA person, and this project manager, and they're going to use those hours to achieve this specific feature. And this is above and beyond what's already been paid for.
Thank you. I think this question has been pretty much answered, but just in case, if anyone wants to add anything, Canvin is asking, in this field, your clients and company are expected to develop, test, maintain, and a secure program code based on specifications. How do you achieve this? If anyone wants to add anything to this.
I'll jump in. So there's actually a couple questions. There's Canvins and also Archdeeps about security being important in applications. So I'll kind of just touch on both of those. So when it comes to securing programs, I mean, I think it goes without, most people are aware in the news cycle, seeing various, leaks or data breaches of various companies. And some of that is very hard to avoid, because you figure if Google or these other larger organizations are struggling, then how are you able to cope with it? But really what I would say is there's tons of tools that are out there that help out with code quality. So like SonarQube is an example of one. Also being able to have dependency vulnerability checkers. Dependabot is one that we use at my work. And so there's tons of tools that are out there in order to kind of make sure that you don't have to constantly stay up to date and making sure, oh, there's a new patch. Well, does that conflict with anything that we have here? There is some automation around it. But then that's where having a quality assurance team that is looking specifically for security vulnerabilities can also play in, especially as we go into a more sort of like jam stack world where, your UI application is separate than the actual API. So it has to be able to accept the UI, but, how do you end up protecting that from malicious actors? And then going into stuff like authentication, relying on third parties like OAuth in order to, secure your application without actually taking on that burden of using, like an email password registration. So those are like some things that you can do, best practices, trying to just encourage your users, if you are doing a registration, making sure that, they're using a capital letter, lowercase letter, symbol, just for like some simple stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can do from the front end from a security standpoint as well. Like you were mentioning, check for those variables inside a text string when they put in their username. There's a reason why a lot of times when registration comes, you get the password, for example, you can't put in certain characters. That's so that way you block out certain routes into your application. Also lowers complexity a little bit, but still, I do agree with everything Chris just said. I think it's the best way to go about it. As well as the little puppy growling in the background.
Yeah. My thing is just rely on smart people, which is like not a good way to, don't do that at work. Don't make other people do your work. But, there are people that are trying to solve these specific problems, and being able to utilize those solutions that are out there. As I was saying about like OAuth, a thing that we use for single sign-on is Okta. So that way, we don't have to manage passwords across multiple applications. They just have a single sign-on, so that way they can access all of the applications with just a single password, which it presents two issues. Like one, if they're able to sign in with that single password, they can access all applications, but also users are also known to reuse passwords. So instead of having one site get compromised, now every site is compromised, they kind of have to, climb essentially a bigger wall of security than having a bunch of little walls.
Thank you. Next question. Kushpreet is asking, what could be the best ways or measures one can follow to perform effective routine maintenance on a database, and how often should these be implemented?
I think this was addressed a little while earlier by one of the questions. I guess key takeaways are how long are queries taking, and what is the volume of data, and that'll help you answer kind of questions about both performance and like backup schedule and compliance. If you are working in an organization that has a compliance department, you will be working with them a lot.
And there's always tools for these things. You will all, like Sonar Cube alone will point out a lot of the issues in your actual REST calls if you have any. But yeah, there's always an application for something.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Again, this one may have been addressed, but let's just touch base on it. Which project development process do you follow? Do you favor one approach over another?
Agile.
Yeah, I think we saw that Michael, for some reason, does waterfall, but I think I would say like both have their pros and cons, which is why both exist. And you'll also see that, I mean, almost to an extent, like a Scrum or Agile thing is just mini waterfall over and over again. And so being able, like, neither's perfect. I think in the real world, though, oftentimes things change as taken point by COVID. And so if you have a project that is scoped out for 1 to 2 years in length, then all of a sudden when COVID kind of throws a wrench into things, if you're kind of already in a process that allows you to reevaluate on certain timelines, then that will allow you to pivot when something like that happens, which is, I think, why, well, it is why Agile or Scrum has, 2-week sprints on average, is so that way after 2 weeks, you can kind of reevaluate and see, are we still solving the business needs?
So there's a bit of a spin-off from Agile that my team uses. So we do everything Agile except for the 2-week sprints. And this depends on where you're working and what project you're doing. In my case, we do Kanban, and that's mainly because we don't sit after 2 weeks. Like, we don't have to wait for the 2-week sprint to be over. We're just continually taking off the backlog. So that's another way that some IT groups do it. For myself, I just find that nicer because when I've done something, there's always something to do. You're not waiting for anything in between.
And that can vary from project to project, even within the same organization. So all of the external projects that I'm doing lean a little more towards the waterfall, just because we do have that statement of work. But for internal projects like process improvement or developing our own tools that we can use on other projects, a lot of that internal stuff is much more of like a traditional Agile approach. So you'll find examples of both within the same organization even.
Yep. And for this is also super common. Usually the higher up you go, the more they prefer waterfall, which is something that I have seen, where executive leadership is more traditionally used to sort of waterfall. And so they want to know, well, how long is this entire project going to take? And they don't like hearing, well, we'll figure it out as we go. That's not something that is usually able to be sold. So not only will organizations have both, but even on the same project will actually have both implemented.
Yeah, like some things do linger around. Like we have a 2-man team on what I'm doing now, and we got asked, "Oh, how long would it take to do this thing that supposedly should take 6 months?" And we want it done by Christmas. So like you will have those questions of like, "Give me man hours," or stuff like that. But ideally I'd stick with Agile personally. It's a lot faster.
Thank you. Let's go to the troubleshooting skills. So we do have a couple questions here. One is, how is troubleshooting done? And what resources are used in big organizations to do that troubleshooting? And another question is, how do you build your troubleshooting skills?
So I'll just start off real quick with this one. Building the troubleshooting skills will start with obviously troubleshooting your own projects. You will start with that. You'll obviously face a lot of issues at first, but you'll start to see the similar errors from certain things, and then you can get the skills from doing that kind of stuff. When it comes to facing certain errors and using a given software, again, you get that knowledge over time, and then you can search it up on the web. Like as much as it is a joke, we do search Google a lot in our jobs. So that's basically what I do on a daily basis. I also, being I work on the front end, I put console logs in like every nook and cranny of my code when something's going wrong, so I can see exactly the path my data is taking. And I use the console built into the browser as well as the networking tab. When you have REST services and stuff like that, you have to debug.
Yeah, I would say that, and to sort of summarize Justin and some of my thoughts, is when you end up running into an error, oftentimes like internally in my mind, I'll put it into different buckets of like, what type of error is it? Is it like a server error? Is it a front end error? And then from once you kind of like categorize what type of error is happening, and truth be told, sometimes you don't know at first. So sometimes you have to go through that process. But once you have a sort of categorized issue, then you can kind of use those skill sets. So if it's something that is on the UI side of things, then being able to use like the dev tools built into the browser to kind of debug what's happening there. If it's on the server, which kind of depends on if you have ownership of that server or not, but that's where you can use tools. What is it? I can't remember off the top of my head. It's end of day. Postman, there we go. So for being able to use Postman for sending request payloads and then seeing what the response is coming back, or if it's an actual UI application hitting it, network tab, and seeing what's kind of coming back. But I would say mostly it comes with experience. And really what I have found is just try playing with stuff. If you go to a line of code that's having an issue and you just comment it out, what happens if you comment it out? If you comment it out, the error goes away technically. But really trying to understand what that code is doing is going to give you the most understanding of how to troubleshoot it.
Knowing your tools as well. If you're doing something in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, get familiar with the debugger. Like I think Virginia and Justin mentioned earlier. With my role, we do automation. It's kind of like the weird sort of point and click automation using something called flow. We can view the input to a flow. We can see all the decision paths, and we can see the variable values as it walked through. When I was starting programming, and even today, probably 8 out of 10 problems that I run into are some variable didn't get set somewhere. So if you have whatever tool you're using, you're able to determine like, what did this variable get set to and when and in what scope. It saved me a lot of headaches.
Yeah, and on my side of things, which is much different than Michael's, when you're dealing with and this might be more advanced than especially what you learn in Georgian, but dealing with like microservices and being able to have like a full trace between the microservices as it goes through. There's a lot of good tooling that's out there that's able to do that. Big common one is Datadog. So being able to see like, you can have all of these services that when they communicate with each other, it usually works. But when there's a specific, when the stars align, you're able to see that this error keeps happening. And then from there, that's how you can kind of more pinpoint on the back end side of things of going, oh, well, when this service talks to, service A talks to service B, and when service B talks to service C after service A talking to it, that's when we have this issue. And so there's a lot of tooling that's out there. You don't have to do it by hand with a stone tablet. So yeah, don't worry about that.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have 3 questions that have kind of a common theme about transitioning from students to professionals, completing your internship and co-op, and also entry-level jobs. So how one transitions from being student to a professional? How do you approach an employer for volunteering, and what entry-level jobs are there that students have higher chances getting into?
So I kind of wanted to jump in on this one. The very first one is transitioning from a student to a professional. It doesn't happen. You're always a student. You're always learning in this career. Things change really quickly. But as for like the actual thing of like, well, I'm going from this like student mindset to a professional mindset. Like, how do I approach that? And I mean, it's really tough, right? Like when you're in school, things are really well defined. You get a rubric, you have expectations from the prof, they give you feedback, you can do it. When you're in the real world, I put that in quotes, things are more gray. You don't always have clear expectations. You don't always have, everything set out of what you need to do. And so part of that is really having a go-getter kind of like attitude, always looking at like how you can improve, how you can do that. But as for what I would say is also probably tied into this is getting your first job. There's tons of opportunity out there. I think it's very clear that computers aren't going anywhere quick, and more things are either being converted from manual processes into automated processes, or even just improving on those already existing automated processes. And so there's tons of opportunity out there. I would say a bigger issue is that there's sometimes not enough senior people out there in order to train the junior people. And so if you have an opportunity where you can find yourself someone who is willing to mentor you, like I myself, I do online mentorship where I work with sort of like beginner, intermediate developers in order to sort of accelerate their career. And what I have found is that those are the people who are willing to do that, are the people who are really interested in their career. And so if you have that sort of attitude where you're wanting to always learn and wanting to kind of dive in, that's the sort of, I would say, attitude that's good to have in order to help get your sort of first job. Because I think what you see is most people want experience in order to start, and that's not always true. What I would say is you don't have to work in Toronto. It's sometimes easier to get jobs outside of Toronto in order to get your first job. And then after you have some experience under your belt, you can kind of go to a larger company and kind of go that way.
Yeah, I would agree. That idea of building that community that you have around you is a really important one, not just for improving your skills, but for making those connections and learning who is hiring right now. So I know like within Salesforce, there's community groups that'll get together and discuss the software, but it's true for every software out there, except, I don't know, maybe COBOL. Just like connecting with people and talking about things you're interested in, asking them questions about cool things that they've built recently. People like talking about their work. And if you can kind of get that engagement with someone where you're learning and you're asking them questions, if they're in a position where they're hiring, that's going to be like a flag to them that this person is actually thinking about the problems that I'm solving, and they're thinking about my approach and maybe they're someone who would, kind of be a sponge and willing to take in like that knowledge from our organization. But also they're a new student, so they might have a completely different sort of outsider's perspective to the problems that we're facing. So I think that idea of just building connections with the people out there that want to connect with you is fundamental. People skills too. You don't have to be super chatty. Just say hello to people, put yourself out there. I know that can be tough, but it's something that can definitely pay dividends.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
I fully agree with a lot of the statements that have been said, especially when Chris said that you're always a student. Remember that, because you're always going to be Googling something, you're always going to be looking something up, and there's no shame in needing to do that. Another thing that I would say, being from the entrepreneurship side of this, is networking, just like Michael was saying, is key. So meeting people and getting out there and really trying to make connections with people is going to be something that's going to probably get you a lead on a possibility of a job. We have things at the college that we do. We have maker nights for code people. We have maker nights. We also have a hackathon coming up, which is what I'm going to talk about right now, because hackathons are a great place for you to work on a team, get those basic skills of team working and, understanding the different types of code, even if you don't know what you're going to be getting yourself into. When I was a student, the first thing that I did as a student was I went to a hackathon on blockchain that the college hosted. I had no idea what blockchain was, but I thought to myself, hey, this is a great place for me to get started in getting to know people. So I got to know people in my grade level. I also got to know people in the grade levels above me, and that was really awesome. So then the next year when they had another hackathon, I was like, hey, I really got to work on this hackathon. So I did yet another hackathon. And then I started actually going out to other colleges and universities and doing hackathons with other people, so that I was really getting my teamwork skills and really throwing myself into the fire, where I got there by myself. I wasn't with anyone, and I just sort of figured out a way to make a team and get on a team and then work out really complex thought problems that the people like RBC and that like asked for. So tell us, there are some really great sponsors and also really great prizes. But I really want you to think about doing those things that are outside of just school, because right now I know that school is your job. That's definitely your job. But even when you have your job, you still have other things that you like to do on the side. So make sure that you're doing some things outside of your coursework that are going to reflect like things like that in your resume, that are really going to make you shine as a candidate, because then you can speak about those opportunities that you have. Maybe you're going to have an amazing opportunity or amazing experience at a hackathon or at a networking event that college is throwing. So think of those outside sources that the college is still offering. The change makers, they have change maker in residency week. It's a great way to get in touch with other students that are around you. And just because there's other students who may not be in computer programming, they could be in business, they could be in marketing, maybe their moms or dads or their friends have a job opportunity for you. So it's always great to go out and meet those new people and get that sort of community together.
Yeah. And I do want to say, just know that those things are optional, and because as someone who works day in, day out, and like since I started my career, I've always looked at like, well, what's going to look good on my resume? Is it the fact that I volunteer with this organization or this side project or this? And it's a very quick way at being able to burn out. And to some degree, what I have seen when I'm looking at resumes is, if I see someone who's like kind of all over the place, like where their portfolio isn't actually not targeted, but it's kind of like, oh, I have a video game here and I have an e-commerce webpage here. And then I also built this like chat application. And I'm like, well, what are you interested in? And sometimes, by doing everything, it's very chaotic, and you don't end up, it's kind of, you try to make yourself marketable to everyone, but by doing that, sometimes it's to no one. But if those are things that you're interested in, feel free to pursue them, but there are plenty of jobs that you can get without having to do extra work outside of work hours. Like I pretty much exclusively work 9 to 5. I don't have time for side projects and other stuff. So don't feel like you have to.
Yeah, I definitely personally slowed down over the last year when it came to side projects, because burnout is something you will hit very hard and very fast if you're not careful. It can affect your performance. It can affect your personal life. So just keep that in mind as you're working. Make sure you have the ways to kind of chill out at night. Don't sit at a computer for 24 hours a day. I did that. It was a long story, but anyways, along with what I'm about to say, I put in the chat basically any link that I've used in the last 6 months to kind of, spread the info around. If you want some practice, go to HackerRank. You basically do practice coding, and when you finish each one, you can post to your LinkedIn that you completed a certain course. Basically, it can go anywhere from problem solving to computer science to basically anything you can think of. But when it comes to getting your first job, I always tell people this, and it can get pretty draining when you're applying everywhere, but apply everywhere. Whether you think you'll be a good fit for the job or not, maybe they look at your resume and they have an associate position in another area that, oh, okay, well, maybe they work better here. And then they'll send your name that way. It doesn't hurt, because in the end, if you don't hear back, you don't hear back. You just got to keep going on with the grind. Don't get discouraged. Do some side projects, but don't overwhelm yourself. Really, I got my first job and all I had was half-finished projects from Georgian. With Manulife, when I joined at an entry-level position, I told them I just want to learn. I want to sit there. I want to have a mentor, and I want to learn. And they took that as okay, he's a great candidate to fill with information. Side note, Michael, Manulife still uses Cobalt. So yeah.
That's okay.
That's a different problem. We can't solve that today.
I mean, the team's all above 60 years old. So, I mean, I don't know, but
yeah, there's one thing about connecting to people about it. I don't know how much of that happens, but hey, if you're going to get paid like $300,000 a year.
Exactly. Yeah. So, as well on the side, when you go into these interviews, depending on what you've applied for, it can be pretty daunting as well, because they'll sit you down for a coding interview and they'll give you a question that's like computer science based. And something I learned from doing that is that that's not stuff I learned in my courses at Georgian. So,
I'll also say that doesn't always happen. So don't. Yeah. There's so many. This is actually something that I've talked with people before. There are so many different variants of interviews that if someone says, well, how should I prepare? Oftentimes, if you can, and you actually have an interview lined up, ask how you're going to be evaluated and ask what the evaluation is. So if someone is wanting to know, let's say you're a web designer and they're wanting to know, oh, does this person have great accessibility skills? They probably don't care about your CSS skills at that point. So if you focus on that part during the interview, they're going to be like, well, he didn't focus on what we're looking for. So if you can, as a part of your interview, ask what you're going to be evaluated for, then you know where to focus your skills during that interview, which is hugely beneficial.
Yeah, like as many times as I've had the computer science based interview, the job I have now is actually the one that stuck out to me. I had 2 offers, one of which was from one of these computer science interviews, but I took the one that wasn't because it left an impression with me. And funny thing is, during the interview, I literally was just like, this code is terrible. Like, I told them that to their face. So like if you can have a laugh, you can show them that you know your stuff, they will look at, how you do from there on. When it comes to learning, don't burn out. If you feel like you need it, go talk to your professors, go talk to your friends. You just need that outlet. 2 big things to keep in mind is burnout is a thing. And one other thing that I see a lot in my industry is imposter syndrome. That's something where you are doing good work, but you feel like you're not. And I've been told hundreds of times that you're doing great, you're doing better than we could ask. But personally, I feel like I'm not doing enough. So keep that in mind. If your manager says you're doing great or your professor says you're doing fine, try not to hate on yourself for that.
And remember that the college has really, really great counselors. So if you're feeling overwhelmed with your workload, I've used it. I know Justin has. I think most of us probably have. Yeah. They are great counselors, and they will help you through it. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and you're feeling stressed, or you're going through something that you don't think anybody else is going to get, go see those counselors, because they have heard it and they will help you.
A lot of companies also have benefits for mental health. Like Manulife, when I was hired there, gave you a 10K 100% covered mental health benefit that you could use. And I went to a social worker twice a week, twice a month all year, and I still only use like 1/3 or 1/4 of it. So if you're lucky enough to get somewhere like that, use those services. Don't be worried. Like, you'll find the balance that you have. You'll find your job. It just takes time, takes dedication.
I also want to do a shout out real quick to, and not on mental health services, but to the Writing Center. If you're having trouble with your resume, or you don't know if you're applying to jobs correctly, or cover letters, the Writing Center is an amazing resource that the college has, where they will go over your resume with you. They will help you with your cover letter. They'll help you in any way that they can to read, look at what you're reading in a job description, and be able to identify in your cover letter what you can do to make it stand out a little bit more. So the Writing Center, your co-op consultants are a really great resource as well. And then a lot of people are asking about mentorship. So if I don't know if the panelists after want to say if they're how students can get in touch with them specifically, but as your alumni association, we do have a mentorship platform for once you graduate. It's called the Georgian Alumni Network. You'll get an email about it, and you can apply to it once you're in your final semester, and then you can do a search for a mentor, or the system will match you with a mentor. So mentorship is huge. Writing Center and your co-op consultants are three really amazing.
And then you can end up here doing exactly what we're doing, helping students get through their stuff.
Actually, I'm pretty sure that the mentorship network is how I reached out to Michael, Chris, and Justin. So it works. Mentorship is amazing.
And we chat regularly on LinkedIn these days.
Yeah. LinkedIn as well. We have an alumni page on LinkedIn, so you can see like Georgian alumni and what they're doing, and see if you can connect with someone that way as well. So a lot of really great resources.
Thank you. So going from soft skills, mental health support, let's touch on one more question about high pressure customer situation. How do you deal with that?
Do you want me to take this one? I'll take this one because I work in consulting. So a lot of times it comes back to people skills. It comes back to empathizing with the person. So it might be the case that, they have expectations and maybe they didn't meet, or maybe what you did didn't meet those expectations. It's a delicate balance, because you do want to kind of own it, but you also you don't want to take the blame and then that's it. You want to move on and progress from there. So a lot of times it can be explaining your thought process to the client, saying, based off of this information that we had, this is the solution that we came up with, and this is how we implemented it. Because it might be coming from someone who maybe they only attend the sprint demos. They're not there day to day, like approving the stories, the user stories or things like that. So it can kind of come down to like talking about what your thought process and rationale was for solving this issue. And then asking them kind of where they see the gaps, because, and making sure that that they know that you want to resolve those gaps. You just need a little more guidance from them, because even though they're a customer and you're not on the same team, you're on the same team. Like, you're working towards the same goal a project. So a lot of times it's kind of just taking a breath, maintaining that composure, and talking through what the issue is, with the end goal of resolving that issue. You should never be approaching those kind of conversations as like, well, it's not how we did it, so too bad. It's
what I would say though is also knowing that, like, so I know some of this is like dealing with high stress with clients. Just because you have a client and you've agreed to work on stuff doesn't necessarily mean that you have to keep them as a client. As much as they can fire you, you are welcome to fire them. It works both ways. I've worked in things where, there's a relationship that starts and you're working with them. And over time, you kind of just realize that, like a normal relationship, sometimes you're not compatible. And so sometimes, I luckily have a large enough network that if there's something that is not right for me, I might know someone who I can refer to. But it is one of those things that, like, you kind of do have to be empathetic and understand that, like, this might be their entire world, especially when you start going into like freelancing or contract work. Some of these people might be starting a business. They've taken out, a second mortgage on their house in order to bootstrap their company. And when you come in and say that something's going to cost $10,000 and they're like, oh my gosh, like I can do 1,000 at most. And, when you first start off, you think, $1,000, that's a lot of money. I can do that. And then when you start looking at how much time you're spending, and this is obviously getting off topic, so I'll kind of end it there, but essentially the relationship between you and your client can cause stress. And so if you can be empathetic and understand their situation, but still say, like, listen, you're coming to me because I'm the knowledge expert and I'm trying to solve this for you. And sometimes just like, being able to remind them of that it's like, hey, while this is your baby and you're paying the bills, I'm the one that knows how to do this. So I think we should do it my way rather than your way. And so sometimes just, doing that can help out. Sometimes it can make it worse, let's be honest. But really what I would just say is, try to be empathetic, and communication is key.
Yeah, I think we both used a lot of words for it, but what we're looking for is honesty. Empathy and honesty are really the two key takeaways so far.
Yes.
And those come with people skills. Like, you really need those people skills, because if you're getting as frustrated as they are, then it's just going to continue to spiral. If they're frustrated and, they're talking to you, if you can talk to them calmly and say exactly what Chris just said, you can usually nullify any, you're giving them support instead of sparking the fire more. And for me, like, I did a little freelancing after school, not very much. Other than that, I really haven't talked to customers since I was a cook for like 10 years before I went back to school. I'm older than I look, but yeah, it's I'm maybe good with people skills, but I'm not the greatest with customers. So it really depends on what route you take. Luckily, I've been in big enough companies that I don't really have to deal with customers too much.
Yeah. And to give an example, sorry to jump in, Virginia, like, I actually had the opposite scenario where I had someone pull rank on their expertise on me, and it kind of put me in my place. So to give context, like, at my work, we have product managers and we also have a designer. And so I kept kind of like critiquing these designs because we have a style guide, and I said, hey, it's not matching this, not matching that. And they're like, yeah, but it's outdated. And I was like, well, it'd be so much easier if we just do this. And they're like, listen, are you the UX guy? And I was like, all right, you win. But it was one of those things where, like, I had to kind of like look at that and be like, this is their place. And if this is the way that they want to design it, knowing context into like why they're doing it that way, they're the knowledge expert. And so that was a situation that kind of put me in my place where I was like, all right, this also isn't a hill that I'm willing to die on. So if the button is blue instead of like blue-ish, then who cares?
Also, doing a good explanation of the expectation versus reality conversation, making sure that when you're having your initial conversations, that you are as much on the same page as you can, and making sure that you're having check-ins with your clients, so that, you know, if I'm doing a 3D print for someone and I'm trying to manage their expectations on how much time it's going to take. And I will say, you know, it could take up to 3 days if the print goes well, but if it doesn't, it could take 10 days. And making sure that they know that I have that little bit of flex time where I work in a process that, you know, it might not always work. So that could happen in when you're working with code as well, just making sure that you're managing those expectations and reality.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end of our session. So there is a last question and a Q&A. Maybe we can touch on that quickly. How is the daily work schedule look like?
I'll just touch on this real quick since mine's pretty short. When it comes to my schedule, luckily my jobs are I make my own hours, but you're generally on between 9 and 4 or 9 and 3, because that's when people schedule the meetings. As long as you do your time in that schedule, it's fine. So, you know, I wake up at 7, I'm on by 7:38, and that way I can get off at 3:30, take my lunch around 11:12. That's about it. During the day, it's whatever gets scheduled. You don't really know until that day, depending, you know, some people will schedule you last minute. And as you can see, your brain is fried by the end of the day either way. So
yeah, for myself, I mean, I think in maybe a much different position. I'm a team and tech lead. And so my team is anywhere from +7 hours in front of me to -3 hours behind me. So I'm kind of like anywhere between 7 a.m. to like 10 p.m. It just kind of depends. But one of the things that's nice is by doing that, you know, I have a little bit more flexibility of when I'm working. But for like a normal day, besides any sort of like meetings, you can have, well, for myself, I think I had a 7-hour day of meetings. So, but a normal person, I would say, is going to be in a point where, you know, you probably start the day and have some sort of like stand up in most software development companies where you kind of give an update from what you did yesterday, what you're doing today, any blockers. You'll maybe code for 2 to 3 hours. Maybe you'll have a meeting during that time, have lunch, maybe another meeting, and then code some more, and then that's it. I would say that that's probably pretty standard, 1 to 2 meetings per day and some coding. But yeah, that's it for me.
Similar sort of flexibility and time zone constraints on my end. We've got folks in BC, we've got folks all the way in New Zealand. So it's much more like kind of a flexibility and aligning your hours with the clients if there's a client meeting, but beyond that, it's really what's going to work for you. So right now, with a particular kind of combination of clients that I'm working with, I have a pretty standard 8:30 to 5 day. But in the new year, if I get like some different projects, I might be switching to something like 10 a.m. to 3:30 and then a couple hours in the evening, just because that's something that works better for me in terms of kind of like how my schedule works and like when my brain is working the best. So it can vary, especially with lots of people working remotely. Chances are this is a trend that's going to continue. I think there's a lot more employers that are willing to have that sort of flexibility as an option.
Yeah, and what I would say though is, in my experience, the more junior you are, typically the less flexibility that you have. Because if you're more junior, if you are paired up with someone, you're kind of tied into their schedule for any sort of like support network or manager and stuff like that. As you do progress in your career, you know, more trustworthy is given, and so your flexibility can increase. But I mean, especially as you know, Michael is saying, in modern day with COVID, you might have total flexibility from day one. I am not starting right now, so I have no idea.
There's one point, because everybody has such a wide array of schedules. It's really interesting to see. So you can manage your expectations with that, to know that you might be working on a team that has odd hours, but also remember that you can decide when your phone goes off. When you decide to say at 7 p.m. it is family time, or at 7 p.m. it is me time, and it is okay to not answer that email. Yep, do not disturb mode. It is a glorious thing, and make sure that you set, like, even if you do have, like, let's say a 9 to 5, make sure that you're setting those boundaries for yourself, that even though you might have been available like till midnight before, just remind yourself that it's okay to take that separation from work and life.
Yeah, don't make my mistake and hook in your Gmail and Slack in with your work stuff, because you'll get messages at 7 a.m. like, oh God, everything's broken.
Yeah, if you are lucky enough to be in a position where you have a work phone, utilize it. This company that I'm at provided me a work phone, and so all of my stuff is there. And so when I'm done for the day, I can set my do not disturb to 5 or 6 o'clock, as long as it's within reason. Yeah, I would say, honestly, when it comes to a normal day, like, your team ultimately, like at past places, the team has created a contract of like, here's expected core working hours, or here's how we communicate, here's how we do this. And so an expectation of, there's a meeting that's at 7 o'clock your time because you have people that are working 3 hours behind you. Sometimes the expectation is you don't have to attend it. There's going to be a recording, you can watch it in your free time, or there's going to be meeting notes that are provided. And so there are tons of different options out there, luckily, now since, almost 2 years of COVID. So asynchronous communication has improved rapidly. But yeah, I mean, what I would say is, as a junior, you should probably expect a good amount of your time to be programming. And then as you get more senior, it will become less and less. Not to scare you, but it could happen.
Thank you very much for answering those questions, and thank you very much for touching on soft skills, on people's skills in your answers. So I believe that concludes our formal Q&A and our formal session. I would like to say huge thanks to Justin, Chris, Michael, and Virginia for providing information and attending this session. And also I would like to thank Aaron at Alumni Association for organizing this. Aaron, would you like to share a little bit how the recording will be shared with our participants before we log off?
Absolutely. So first off, I want to thank Olena for hosting today with our panelists, and thank you so much to our panelists today. And thank yous to our students for asking such amazing questions, and for engaging our panelists. What an amazing session. So within the next 24 hours, you're going to receive an email from Zoom, just like how you did when you registered. The email will contain a YouTube link, and that YouTube link will be your link to watch the video on YouTube. So that'll be available. If you have any further questions for our panelists, I believe some of them posted their LinkedIn or other communication methods for you, or please feel free to reach out to myself at your alumni association, just alumni@georgiancollege.ca, or your co-op consultant. Okay. So I'm going to end the recording now. Thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much.